On the morning of October 8th, 1905, the fog came in like a memory that no one wanted to recall. Dense, low, curling over the cracked cobblestone streets of Graymere with the softness of a ghost's caress, as though it had risen from the forest itself. Chimney smoke fought its way through the dampness, spiraling above rooftops like hesitant prayers. But the sky remained a steel-gray veil, unmoved and unbroken. The frost that had visited during the night still lingered on the windows, drawing thin white maps across the glass, fragile continents that would melt away with the first touch of sun, if the sun ever came. Graymere was a small town, forgotten by most maps, nestled between two steep hills that kept it isolated even in the best of seasons. It was the kind of place where silence meant something, where the wind spoke in tones the living had learned to ignore, and where church bells echoed far longer than they should. That morning, the silence was unusual, not for its presence, but for its weight. It pressed down on the town, clung to the collarbones of its residents, and curled beneath their fingernails like soil. By 8:45 a.m., the bell at St. Lawrence Chapel rang once, a dull, single chime that sounded not of ceremony, but of warning. The usual pastor, Reverend Ashfield, had fallen ill 3 days prior, and in his place stood a stranger, a tall, pale man named Elias Crane, who had arrived unannounced, carrying only a single black satchel and a weather-beaten Bible. He claimed to have been sent from the district diocese as a temporary substitute. No one had questioned him. The people of Graymere were polite, if not overly trusting, and the letter he presented, though oddly typed and unsigned, seemed sufficient. And so the families dressed in their Sabbath best, mothers pinning hats and straightening collars, fathers brushing mud from their boots, children squirming with Bud. Orly contained energy. 52 families in total, representing nearly 2/3 of the town, prepared themselves for the weekly walk or buggy ride to the chapel, which stood alone at the edge of the Weeping Wood. The road to the chapel was lined with leafless trees, whose branches arched overhead like clasped hands, and the fallen leaves beneath carriage wheels made a crunching sound that was both rhythmic and hollow. Some children ran ahead, kicking piles of leaves and shouting to one another in sing-song voices. It was a typical Sunday in every visible way, and yet many of those left behind, elderly neighbors, the bedridden, and a few solitary souls who had never taken to organized religion, reported a strange stillness in the air, a kind of pause in time, as though something was waiting. They watched from windows as the long parade of families passed by, some waving, some nodding, but all eventually disappearing into the tree-lined path that led to St. Lawrence. Then came the waiting. Noon passed. 1 o'clock. 2. By 3, whispers had begun. It was unlike the people of Graymere to linger so long after service. Lunches were going cold. Soup pots left simmering. Children's toys untouched by returning hands. Wives who had stayed behind began to step onto porches. Fathers of the sick paced nervously. Dog barked without cause, their hackles raised toward nothing. By 3:15, 3 men, Mr. Reeve, Mr. Denton, and the town carpenter, Mr. Halvers, took it upon themselves to walk the 1.5-mile path to the chapel. What they found when they arrived was not chaos nor violence. It was emptiness. The chapel stood as it always had, whitewashed, with a stone foundation and a simple wooden cross, but the doors were shut tight, bolted from within. The windows were darkened by the fog, but not broken. The horse rails were empty. Not a single carriage or wagon remained. The men knocked, then pounded. There was no answer. They walked the perimeter, peering into windows. It was difficult to see much through the warped glass, but one thing was certain. The place was still, lit. The faint orange glow of candlelight flickered near the altar. The smell of smoke drifted faintly from the cracks in the door. Mr. Halvors cupped his hands to the glass and swore he saw something move. A shadow, maybe, but when he blinked, it was gone. They ran back. Sheriff Bell, a man more comfortable dealing with drunkards and stolen chickens than missing congregations, was summoned from his porch. He arrived with deputies and a crowbar. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long and unnatural shadows across the frost-bitten earth, the crowd of worried townsfolk gathered before the chapel steps. Mothers clutched at handkerchiefs. Fathers whispered among themselves. A few children wept without knowing why, and then, just before the sheriff gave the order to force the doors, there came a sound. Not from within, but from behind, from the forest. A single note, low and drawn out, like a cello string pulled too tight. Then silence. Sheriff Bell's face had gone white. The men stared at the trees. The women turned to the chapel, and then, very quietly, the oldest man in town, Josiah Withers, aged 92 and nearly blind, said something no one wanted to hear. "That's not the first time they've vanished." The crowd turned to him. He said nothing more. Sheriff Bell gave the nod, and the doors were breached. But what they found inside would not come until the next chapter. That night, the people of Graymire returned home in fear, their loved ones still missing, their chapel locked behind them, and the single note still ringing somewhere in their bones. And so the whisper began, quietly, from mouth to mouth, behind closed doors and beneath candlelight. They're gone. Sheriff Thomas Bell stood at the chapel doors with his hat pressed tight against his chest, heart pounding not with fear, but with a confused dread he didn't yet know how to name, as his two deputies, Heron and Lyle, wedged the crowbar into the old oak seam and forced open the sacred threshold of St. Lawrence Chapel, breaking the silence that had swallowed Graymere for hours. The heavy doors groaned with the fatigue of age and secrets as they gave way. The scent that met them immediately thick and stifling. Candle wax, incense, something faintly metallic, and something else entirely unfamiliar, yet instinctively revolting, like the distant memory of decay buried beneath layers of time. The congregation's absence was a wound that echoed in the architecture itself, each pew sitting in perfect order. Every hymnal opened as if frozen mid-verse. All 52 Bibles resting quietly. Names inked in cursive on the inside covers, precisely where the families had left them. And, above all of it, the flickering of candles still burning steadily, the wax pooled in silver trails over brass holders, untouched by wind or breath or prayer. And there, too, at the communion table, bread unbroken, wine unstirred, the holy sacraments undisturbed as if a ceremony had been prepared and abandoned at the moment of revelation. In the far right corner, a baby's rattle sat upon the floor, delicate, wooden, and still slightly warm to the touch, as though held only moments ago by a mother now erased from existence, while the air pulsed with the kind of silence that seemed not empty but rather filled with something unseen, thick, watching, expectant. Sheriff Bell whispered the name of his wife without meaning to, as if calling her would protect him from whatever lingered in the corners of the chapel's long shadow. And behind him, Lyle made the sign of the cross with hands that shook not from cold but the unspoken weight of the moment. The deeper they moved into the church, the more the sense of wrongness thickened. No signs of a struggle, no overturned pews or dropped items, no blood or footprints, not even dust disturbed, as though a blanket of reverence had been artificially laid across the scene. And as the rest of the townsfolk gathered outside with anxious breath and whispered prayers, old Marnie Till, the blind woman who had once lived as a midwife and now spent her days rocking endlessly on her porch, facing nothing in particular, muttered under her breath, "They rehearsed it in '49, but back then they were interrupted." A sentence that drew confused stares and nervous glances, though no one dared press her too hard, especially when she followed it up with a single word that would not leave Graymeyer for weeks afterward. "Covenant," she croaked. A name or a warning or a curse, no one could tell, and when asked again she only repeated it, fainter each time as if saying it drained some invisible reservoir of memory or life force. That night, every record in the chapel's registry was reviewed. No mention of Elias Crane, no dispatch from the diocese, no rail records or telegrams confirming the arrival of any visiting clergy. And even his signature on the supposed letter of appointment bore inconsistency, the kind only noticed when compared under lamplight with genuine correspondence. And though the man had stood before the people and spoken the liturgy with solemn confidence, his name was suddenly nowhere. No room at the boarding house had been rented in his name, no witness had seen him arrive, no carriage was known to have delivered him, and the room in which he was thought to have stayed, locked, undisturbed, and completely empty except for the indentation of boots on the wooden floor that ended abruptly at the window, which had remained sealed shut from the outside. In the days that followed, the town searched relentlessly, lanterns bobbing in the fields, search dogs sniffing paths, every tree and ditch and well combed with desperate purpose. Yet nothing was ever found. No tracks, no bodies, no sign that so many families had ever existed outside memory. And the only thread came unexpectedly from a child. Young Henry Bravish, playing near the back of the chapel where the overgrown hedgerow brushed against its stone foundation, when he tripped and his heel dislodged a moss-covered slab that rang hollow beneath his fall. Curious adults gathered, digging cautiously, until the stone was lifted to reveal a narrow opening, pitch black and breathing cold. And further excavation unearthed what none had expected, a spiral staircase of ancient stone, descending in tight, suffocating turns beneath the chapel, concealed behind the very altar itself, which had stood for decades atop what was now revealed to be a hidden shaft leading deep into the earth. No blueprint of the chapel contained mention of such a stairwell, and no town records acknowledged the existence of anything beneath St. Lawrence except soil and stone. Yet here it was, a stairwell slick with condensation and etched with symbols that neither priest nor historian could interpret. Half-formed circles, crosses with too many arms, mouths without faces, and what appeared to be script not written in ink, but in scratches, gouged into the wall by something with neither patience nor hands. Sheriff Bell assembled 5 men, himself, his 2 deputies, and 2 volunteers. Thomas Eber, a gravedigger by trade, and Micah Crims, a teacher with a love of folklore. And they descended with lanterns, their shadows cast in a nervous ballet against the curving walls, their breaths shallow, footsteps muted by the oppressive air. And as they moved deeper, the chill intensified, not in degrees but in sensation, as if something were drawing heat from them deliberately, a hunger in the stone itself. After what felt like hours, the staircase widened into a corridor carved with obsessive care into the bedrock, its floor strangely smooth, its walls covered in markings now unmistakably deliberate, depicting processions of figures robed in black, hands raised not in prayer, but in surrender, the ire heads bowed before a towering presence whose features had been scratched away entirely, leaving only an outline of a crown, or perhaps horns. Eber's lantern flickered and died first, then Heron's, then Micah's, leaving only Bell and Lyle's lights to press the dark aside. And even then, the air grew tighter, heavier, until they entered a chamber. Vast, echoing, the size of a barn, but with ceilings lost in shadow. And within it, the scent changed again. Wax and iron, but deeper now, more foul. And though no one spoke, each man felt the same truth at once. They were being watched. In the center of the room, a stone slab, an altar perhaps, or a table, was surrounded by dozens of objects. Shoes, hats, gloves, spectacles, all arranged with eerie precision, as if laid out for inventory or ritual. And above the altar on the far wall was a mural made not of paint, but of black ash or char, depicting a single enormous mouth, open in an eternal scream, with dozens of smaller mouths painted around it, none connected to faces. As the 5 men approached, something shifted, a sound like whispering silk, a gust of wind in a sealed room, and then the lanterns sputtered. Thomas Eber fell first, collapsed to his knees with a strangled cry before slumping forward, unresponsive, eyes open but glassy. Lyle tried to retreat but struck the wall, dropping his lantern, and as its flame guttered out, Bell screamed for everyone to grab hands. But it was too late. The darkness took them, not like blindness, but like drowning, thick, pulsing, filled with something that pressed into their ears and mouths and minds, until nothing made sense, until time stuttered and folded, until the concept of return was replaced by something more primal. Survival. When Bell woke, he lay at the base of the chapel's altar once more, the trap door sealed behind him. No sign of the others except for Lyle, unconscious but alive, clutching something in his palm, a single strand of dark red cloth, frayed at both ends and wet to the touch. The others were never found again. The shaft below, when reopened, led only to collapsed, at rock, as if the earth had devoured itself in shame or rage. And from that moment forward, Sheriff Bell never entered the chapel again, never spoke of what he saw, and never answered when asked what happened during that missing hour between hymns. The descent into the darkness beneath St. Lawrence had not ended with the staircase or the corridor. There had been more, far more than anyone had anticipated. Twists and drops and narrow chasms that swallowed light and echoed back only the sound of breath and boots, as if the tunnels themselves were remembering the footsteps of those who had already passed into silence. And when the sheriff and his dwindling team of searchers pushed forward into that ancient blackness, They did not realize until it was too late that they were no longer in a mine, nor in anything made by man at all, but rather something older, something carved by ritual or madness or time itself. And when the last wall gave way into the great cavern, they emerged not as rescuers, but as witnesses. Stepping into a space so cavernous and unnatural, it felt like the hollow chest of a sleeping beast. The air inside humid and motionless, like the stagnant breath of something once divine and long since perverted. The walls glistened with dampness and age, and the floor, smoothed by use or reverence or both, stretched in every direction, littered not with rubble or ore, but with the possessions of the missing. Rows of shoes placed side by side, children's bonnets folded like offerings, spectacles resting atop carefully laid shawls, wedding rings strung together with twine and hung like ceremonial garlands between stalagmites that shimmered in the lantern light. At the center of the cavern was the altar, massive, ancient, carved from a single block of black stone that seemed to drink the light, its surface etched with runes that pulsed with a faint oily sheen, its corner worn not by weather but by touch, as if countless hands had rested there in petition or punishment. And behind the altar rose the mural, not a painting but a horror. Rows upon rows of mouths, painted, in some red-black substance that refused to dry, each mouth wide open, teeth bared, screaming not in motion but in suggestion, and yet without faces, as if the very concept of identity had been stripped from whatever force had once voiced that scream, and the longer one stared, the more the mural seemed to shift, as though the mouths whispered in a tongue older than breath. And there, in front of the altar, huddled in the fetal position on the smooth, cold stone, was a girl, no older than 10, hair matted, skin pale as bone, her dress torn but folded beneath her, as if she had sat that way for hours or days, and her eyes, when they opened, were not wild or scared, but hollow, a stillness inside them that suggested not trauma but surrender. When Sheriff Bell approached, she did not flinch, did not move, did not even blink, but her fingers twitched in the dust, dragging faint lines into the floor until finally, shakily, she formed a single word in the dirt between them, rehearsal, and then dropped her hand, never to lift it again in willful expression. They tried to lift her, and she allowed it, limbs limp, breath shallow but steady. Yet she spoke no sound, not even in sleep, and in the weeks that followed as the doctors examined her and the townsfolk whispered about her origin, she remained mute, writing nothing more, her eyes sometimes darting to the horizon as if expecting something to return from the tree line. The search continued, but no other survivors were ever found, and though they returned to the cavern once more with more light and more men, the altar remained. But the mural had changed. The mouths were fewer, and one of them was now closed. The belongings of the 52 families remained, untouched, undisturbed, but not a single body was discovered, no bones, no trace of blood, as if the earth had swallowed the people whole and left behind only what it could not digest. Then came the collapse. Weeks later, when no one expected it, the chapel cracked and sank into itself like a grave being closed from below, taking with it the stairwell, the altar, the mural, and whatever truth lay buried beneath Graymere's holy ground. And the town was never the same. The girl, still nameless, was taken in by a midwife who had once delivered most of the children now gone, and though she cared for the child with tenderness and patience, the girl remained distant, never once smiling, never once playing, and often waking in the middle of the night soaked in sweat, eyes staring at the ceiling, lips moving silently as if mouthing prayers she could no longer hear. Sheriff Bell resigned within the year, his hair white, his hands trembling even in sleep, and those who asked him what had happened beneath the chapel were met with a haunted stare and a slow shake of the head. By 1910, Graymere was nearly empty, its schoolhouse shuttered, its shops boarded, and its once vibrant streets now overgrown with moss and vines. No family that had remained in town would speak of that day, and none who had left ever returned to visit. The girl, who had grown but never laughed, died at 19 from causes never explained, and her final journal, found beneath her mattress, contained only a single repeated sentence scrawled in dozens of variations. The mouths remember and the mouths rehearse. The land where St. Lawrence once stood was declared unfit for settlement by county authorities, citing unexplained sinkholes and magnetic interference, though the real reason was never recorded. No animals would graze near the ruins, and birds avoided the treetops above its perimeter. In the years that followed, thrill-seekers and ghost hunters came and went, but those who stayed beyond sundown often emerged broken, raving, weeping, or worse, silent forever, much like the girl who had first been found before the altar. And still, every October, on the anniversary of that Sunday, if one dares to stand in the clearing beneath the dead branches where the chapel once held its congregation, they say you can hear a bell, not ringing in joy or ceremony, but once, only once, deep and low and final, as if echoing from beneath the ground itself, marking not the beginning of something holy, but the end of something rehearsed too many times and, finally, perfectly performed.